They were just a normal family on a summer road trip until they vanished into thin air. For 7 long, agonizing years, searches turned up nothing. Hopes faded, and the case went ice cold. Their disappearance became a haunting mystery that gripped a quiet town and left loved ones in an unbearable state of not knowing. But the wilderness held a secret, waiting to be found. Years later, a chance discovery deep in the woods unearthed a single, crucial clue, one that would crack the case wide open. What terrible truth had been hidden all this time? Join us as we follow the trail of evidence that finally revealed the fate of the Miller family. The answer is more complex and heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined. Watch the full story to the very end and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Like and subscribe for more true mysteries. The late June sun, a buttery gold, spilled across the kitchen table, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air above half-empty cereal bowls. Mary Miller hummed softly, wiping down the counter with a practiced hand. The rhythm of the cloth, a familiar comfort on this ordinary Saturday morning. Outside, the sprinklers clicked on, a gentle hiss against the backdrop of chirping birds, the quintessential soundtrack of suburban life in Oak Haven, Ohio. In the living room, 10-year-old Tom was sprawled on the carpet, deeply engrossed in a cartoon, his bare feet kicking idly in the air. Upstairs, the telltale muffled thud of pop music pulsed from Emily's room. A sure sign the 15-year-old was already immersed in her own world, likely perfecting her winged eyeliner for a FaceTime call that wouldn't happen for hours. John, Mary's husband, leaned against the doorframe, nursing a mug of coffee, the steam warming his face. A comfortable silence stretched between them, built on 17 years of shared mornings, school runs, and bedtime stories. He had that relaxed look he only wore when the weekend truly began, the faint lines around his eyes softening. "Everything packed?" he asked, a smile playing on his lips. Mary returned the smile, rinsing the cloth. "Almost. Just the last-minute things." And convincing Emily that she doesn't need her entire closet for a week at Aunt Carol's, John chuckled. "Good luck with that. Think she'll survive without Wi-Fi for more than an hour." "She'll have to," Mary said, though a tiny knot of worry tightened in her stomach. Emily was at that age where family trips, especially to visit older relatives in the middle of nowhere, Iowa, were viewed with the enthusiasm reserved for root canals. This trip, though, felt important. A chance to reconnect, to escape the everyday hum of work and school and just be a family for a little while before Emily started high school in the fall. "Tom, are you ready to ditch the cartoons and help load the car?" John called out, his voice warm but firm. A groan echoed from the living room, followed by the shuffle of small feet. Tom appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes despite being awake for hours. "Do I have to?" "Yes, you do," Mary said, ruffling his hair. "The sooner we get everything in, the sooner we can get on the road. Think of the rest stops, and maybe we can find a place with really good milkshakes." That got his attention. Tom's eyes lit up. "Milkshakes?" "Maybe," John confirmed, pushing off the door frame. "Now, go grab those duffel bags by the back door, the blue one and the red one." As Tom scurried off, Mary watched John head towards the garage. He was a good man, a steady presence. A little quiet sometimes, but his love for them was a constant, like the sturdy oak tree in their front yard. They were, by all accounts, a normal family. A little messy, sometimes loud, always busy. They argued over chores and screen time, celebrated good grades and soccer goals, worried about bills and the future. They were them. Upstairs, Emily's music abruptly stopped. Silence. Then heavy footsteps on the stairs. Emily appeared, backpack slung over one shoulder, a look of practiced martyrdom on her face. Her dark hair was perfectly straightened, her makeup already flawless. "Okay, I'm ready," she announced, though her tone suggested she was anything but. "Can we please leave before it gets dark? Aunt Carol lives like in the actual middle of nowhere." "We're leaving in 20 minutes, Em," Mary said gently. "Plenty of daylight left. Did you get your phone charger? Emily patted her backpack. Yep, and snacks. Lots of snacks. You guys never pack enough good ones. Hey! Mary laughed, but the small knot in her stomach tightened again. An unfounded anxiety, she told herself. Just the usual pre-trip jitters. Within the next half hour, the flurry of activity reached its peak. Bags were hauled from bedrooms, coolers packed with sandwiches and drinks, last-minute bathroom breaks taken. John expertly Tetrisid everything into the back of their reliable, albeit slightly dented, minivan. Tom bounced with excitement, already strapped into his seat, pointing out license plates as soon as they backed out of the driveway. Mary got into the passenger seat, fastening her seatbelt. She took a deep breath. The familiar scent of the car's upholstery mixed with sunscreen and the faint sweetness of Emily's perfume. John put the car in drive, and they pulled away from the curb, leaving behind the quiet, familiar streets of Oakhaven. The open road stretched before them, shimmering in the summer heat. The sky was a vast, endless blue. They were together, heading west towards family and a week of simple pleasures. Mary turned to look at her children in the rearview mirror. Tom was already nodding off, his head tilted against the window. Emily was staring out her own window, earbud in, a small, almost imperceptible smile on her face. Everything felt perfect, normal. It was the kind of moment you didn't realize was precious until it was gone. The kind of peace you only appreciate in hindsight, standing at the edge of a chasm you never saw coming. They drove on, the engine a steady hum, the tires a soft whisper on the asphalt, completely unaware that this was the last time they would all be together, heading towards a future that would never arrive. The minivan ate up the miles, the yellow line blurring beneath the wheels as they cruised west on I-70. Inside, the atmosphere was light, a typical road trip tableau. John had his hand resting on Mary's knee, occasionally tapping the steering wheel in time with the classic rock station playing softly. Tom, revived by the promise of milkshakes, was pointing out every billboard and oddly shaped cloud. Emily, earbuds now firmly in place, was lost in her music again, a faint smile suggesting the playlist was hitting just right. The flat, green fields of Ohio gave way to the rolling hills of Indiana, then the wide-open skies of Illinois. The air conditioning hummed a steady, cool counterpoint to the warm sun streaming through the windows. They talked about everything and nothing. Summer plans, school, embarrassing family stories about Aunt Carol's cats. It was easy, comfortable, the kind of time families cherish, even when they don't realize it. Around lunchtime, John pulled off the highway at a sign for a rest area with a diner, a classic, slightly faded place called the Prairie Stop. The bell above the door jingled merrily as they entered, the air thick with the comforting smell of coffee and fried food. They slid into a vinyl booth, the kind with the ripped seats patched with tape. They ordered burgers and fries, milkshakes for the kids. Tom proudly stacked ketchup packets while Emily scrolled through her phone, occasionally sharing a funny meme with Mary. It was a perfect snapshot of mundane happiness. John paid the bill, leaving a generous tip for the waitress who had called Tom honey and winked at Emily. Back in the car, they felt full and content, ready to tackle the next stretch of road. Next stop, maybe that giant ball of twine everyone talks about, Mary joked, pulling up a quirky roadside attraction on her phone. John laughed. Maybe, on the way back. Let's make good time today. As the miles continued to tick by, the landscape shifted subtly. Fields gave way to more trees, denser pockets of forest alongside the highway. The sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, in a small farmhouse outside Des Moines, Iowa, Aunt Carol checked her watch for the 5th time in the last hour. They should be here by now. Or at least close. Mary had said they expected to pull in around dinner time. The casserole was ready, the spare room aired out, the porch light on. Carol picked up her phone and dialed Mary's number. It rang, and rang, then went to voicemail. She thought. Maybe they stopped for gas and left their phones in the car. Road trips could be like that. She sent a quick text. Everything okay? Just checking in. Dinner is ready when you get here. She waited a few minutes. No reply. Strange. Mary was usually so prompt, especially when they were on the road. Signal could be spotty out west, but not this spotty. Carol tried John's number. Same thing. Straight to voicemail after several rings. A faint ripple of unease disturbed Carol's calm. She tried Emily's number, then Tom's. She knew they'd given him a cheap prepaid phone for emergencies, though it rarely left his side. All went to voicemail. This was more than just spotty signal. Carol frowned, tapping her fingers on the kitchen counter. She tried calling Mary again, and again. Each time, the polite, automated voice of the voicemail system felt less polite and more unsettling. She paced to the window, looking down the long, empty driveway. No headlights, no familiar minivan. She picked up her home phone and dialed Sarah, Mary's best friend back in Oak Haven. Sarah would know if plans had changed. "Hey, Carol, everything okay?" Sarah's voice was cheerful, oblivious. "Hi, Sarah. Listen, have you heard from Mary or John? They were supposed to be here by now, or almost here, and I can't reach any of them." Sarah paused. No, I haven't talked to them since they left this morning. I figured they'd be busy driving. Signal can be rough out there, right? That's what I thought at first, but all 4 phones? Carol's voice was beginning to betray her growing anxiety. And they haven't responded to my texts. A beat of silence on Sarah's end. That is weird. Mary always texts back quickly, even just a thumbs up or something. Exactly, Carol said, the ripple of unease now a definite wave. Do you think something could have happened? Sarah's cheerful tone was gone, replaced by a cautious worry. Happened? Like, what kind of happened? I don't know, Carol admitted, her voice trembling slightly. A breakdown? An accident? It's been hours past when they thought they'd be here. Okay, don't panic yet, Sarah said, though her voice was tight with building concern. Maybe they just took a wrong turn, or stopped somewhere unexpected and their batteries died? It happens. 4 dead batteries at the same time? Carol countered, her grip tightening on the phone. Sarah, something doesn't feel right. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple outside Carol's window, a beautiful, indifferent backdrop to the cold, heavy dread settling in her stomach. The quiet hum of her refrigerator suddenly sounded deafening in the silence that stretched between her and Sarah on the phone. The road trip, the simple family vacation, had veered off course. And the silence that followed felt vast, terrifying, and utterly, completely wrong. The phone felt slick in Carol's hand. Across the line, Sarah's breath hitched. The brief, awkward silence that followed Carol's confession of dread stretched into a chasm. Okay, Sarah finally said, her voice a little shaky now. Okay. Let's think. Where were they heading when Mary last texted you? They were planning to stop for gas maybe an hour or so east of Davenport, Iowa, Carol said, trying to keep her voice steady. She walked back to her kitchen table, sinking onto a chair. The uneaten casserole sat like a lead weight in the center. That was 4 hours ago. She looked at the clock. 5 hours now. And nothing since, Sarah pressed. Nothing, no calls, no texts, nothing delivered to any of their phones. Carol rubbed her temples. Mary always checks in, even when she thinks I'm fussing too much. This isn't like her, Sarah. It's not like any of them. Right, Sarah said, a new firmness entering her tone, pushing back against the fear. Okay, first step. We need to call the police. The police? Carol's stomach clenched. It felt drastic. Until now, it had just been worry, a bad feeling. Calling the police made it real. Yes, the police, Sarah insisted. the local police in the area where they were last seen or heading towards. Davenport, or maybe the next county over. We need to report them as missing. Missing. The word hung in the air, heavy and chilling. After a few more minutes of frantic discussion, they decided Carol would call the sheriff's department in the county where the family was supposed to be traveling through. Sarah would call the Oak Haven Police Department in Ohio, just to get the report started on that end too, though they knew the real search would need to happen further west. Carol found the number for the county sheriff's office in rural Iowa online. Her finger hovered over the call button. Her hand was trembling. It's just a misunderstanding, she told herself. Bad signal, dead batteries, a wrong turn. They'll call any minute, laughing at how she worried. She dialed. The phone rang several times before a dispatcher answered, her voice calm and professional, a stark contrast to the frantic beat of Carol's heart. Sheriff's Department. Yes, hello, Carol began, her voice tight. I need to report some missing people, a family, the Millers. Okay, ma'am, the dispatcher said, her tone even, ready to take down routine information. Can I get your name and relationship to the individuals? Carol gave her name and explained she was the aunt they were traveling to visit. She provided Mary, John, Emily, and Tom's names and descriptions, the make and model of their minivan, their planned route, and when they were last heard from. As Carol spoke, she could almost hear the mental checklist the dispatcher was going through. Missing persons report, standard procedure. And when were they last heard from exactly? The dispatcher asked. Around noon today, Carol said. They were about an hour east of Davenport. They were due here hours ago, and none of their phones are working. All 4 of them. There was a brief pause on the other end. Okay, ma'am. So, they failed to arrive as scheduled, and their phones are off or out of service? Yes, Carol confirmed, feeling a prickle of frustration. Was she not conveying the urgency? But it's all 4 phones, and they haven't responded to any texts for hours. That's not normal. We understand your concern, ma'am, the dispatcher said, her voice still calm, perhaps a shade wearier now. However, with people traveling, especially through areas with potentially spotty cell service, losing contact for several hours isn't uncommon. Vehicles break down, people take detours, phones die. Our protocol for an adult missing persons report typically requires a waiting period, unless there are specific circumstances suggesting immediate danger. Specific circumstances? Carol's voice rose slightly. They're a family with 2 children, and all their phones are off. Yes, ma'am, and I've logged all that information, the dispatcher replied, her tone firm but not unkind. We will certainly put out an alert, especially regarding the children. However, without any evidence of foul play or an accident at this time, it will be handled as a standard failure to arrive missing persons report. We'll need to wait a few hours to see if they make contact. In the meantime, we'll notify the highway patrol to keep an eye out for their vehicle. Carol's heart sank. A few hours? They'd already been incommunicado for 5. It felt like precious time slipping away while bureaucracy churned. She hung up the phone, feeling profoundly helpless. Sarah called back a few minutes later, having had a similar experience with the Oak Haven police. Polite concern, but no immediate sense of alarm. They said they'd file a report and contact the Iowa authorities, Sarah reported, her voice tight with suppressed fear. But they also said the same thing about the waiting period. Unless there's something concrete. Something concrete? Carol echoed, looking out her window at the darkening sky. The warm glow of the porch light seemed insufficient to push back the growing shadows. The vastness of the country suddenly felt less like a welcoming landscape and more like a place where people could simply vanish. They were out there, somewhere, or not out there. The unknown was a suffocating blanket, and the system, built for logical steps and waiting periods, felt agonizingly slow in the face of a fear that was anything but logical. The first tendrils of genuine terror began to wrap around Carol's heart, cold and sharp. The quiet of her farmhouse, usually comforting, now felt like a hollow echo of a silence far more terrifying. Sleep offered no refuge. For Carol, the night was a blur of pacing, redialing disconnected phones, and hushed, anxious conversations with Sarah and other relatives. Each unanswered call was a fresh stab of fear. Each passing hour felt like another nail in the coffin of hope. The calm assurances from the dispatcher the previous evening now felt like a cruel joke. When dawn finally broke, painting the Iowa sky in pale, indifferent hues, the knot in Carol's stomach had tightened into a hard, painful stone. She called the sheriff's department again. This time, her voice wasn't just anxious, it was edged with a desperate, unwavering certainty. "They are missing," she stated, bypassing the initial pleasantries. "It's been over 12 hours. No contact, no sign of them. This is not a delay. Something is wrong." On the other end, the tone had shifted. The calm, almost dismissive air was gone, replaced by more serious, focused demeanor. The deputy who took the call listened intently as Carol reiterated the details, her voice cracking with emotion. The fact that all 4 phones were simultaneously off or out of service, coupled with the significant passage of time and the lack of any trace along their reported route, had elevated the situation. This wasn't just a delayed arrival anymore. "Okay, ma'am," the deputy said. "We understand. This is being escalated. We've already put out a bulletin to surrounding counties and the State Highway Patrol to look for the Miller vehicle." He explained that since the family was traveling across state lines and involved minor children, the case met the criteria for federal assistance. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, was being notified. The mention of the FBI, a name synonymous with serious, complex investigations, was both terrifying and, strangely, a small comfort. It meant the full weight of law enforcement resources might finally be brought to bear. While Carol was dealing with the authorities in Iowa, Sarah was doing the same in Ohio. The Oak Haven police, now receiving confirmation from Iowa that the family had indeed not arrived and could not be located, also moved the case from a low-priority welfare check to an active missing persons investigation. Suddenly, the quiet concern of the previous night erupted into a coordinated effort spanning multiple states. Investigators in Ohio began building a profile of the family, interviewing friends, neighbors, and colleagues, trying to identify any potential reasons for them to disappear or any signs of trouble. Meanwhile, in Iowa and the states in between, the physical search began. Maps of the family's planned route were spread out on tables in police stations and sheriff's offices. The long ribbon of Highway I-70 and the potential state highways they might have taken once they veered north into Iowa became the focus. Patrol cars began systematically driving the route, looking for any sign of the minivan on the roadside at rest stops or in small towns along the way. Highway cameras and traffic logs were reviewed, looking for any sighting of their specific vehicle. Local law enforcement in every town along the route was alerted. Missing persons flyers, initially simple descriptions, were quickly being drafted with photographs of Mary, John, Emily, and Tom, smiling faces frozen in time, soon to be plastered on notice boards and shared online across the country. For Carol and Sarah, this expansion of the search brought a new kind of agony. The vastness of the area being searched highlighted just how easily a vehicle, or a family, could simply vanish. News channels, initially hesitant, started picking up the story. A local family, on vacation, disappeared without a trace. The polite, concerned inquiries from reporters added another layer of surreal anxiety to Carol's already overwhelmed state. Standing by her window, watching the rising sun fully illuminate the emptiness of her driveway, Carol clutched her phone. The official search had begun. The system was finally engaged. But the terrifying silence from the Miller family remained unbroken. The hopeful journey west had ended in a terrifying, inexplicable void, and the dawning realization of the sheer scale of that void was a cold, heavy weight on her soul. This was no longer just about finding them delayed, it was about finding them, period, and the search had only just begun. The days bled into weeks. The initial flurry of activity, the patrol cars crisscrossing state lines, the helicopters scanning vast stretches of highway and forest, the tireless volunteers walking shoulders of roads with hopeful, then increasingly grim, expressions, began to slow. The intensive search efforts, while comprehensive, had yielded nothing. Absolutely nothing. The Miller family minivan, blue and slightly dented, had simply vanished. There were no skid marks on the highway, no signs of a crash in any ditch or ravine, no witnesses who reported seeing the vehicle after that presumed stop near Davenport. It was as if the asphalt had simply swallowed them whole. Detective Robert Roberts, a man whose career had spanned 2 decades and seen more than his share of human tragedy, felt the familiar, bitter taste of a case turning cold settling in the back of his throat. He sat in the Iowa Sheriff's Office, staring at the large map pinned to the wall, covered in red and blue lines marking searched areas, potential routes, dead-end leads. It looked like a spider web, intricate and sprawling, but ultimately catching nothing. "Nothing?" he asked his colleague, his voice flat, devoid of the initial urgency that had fueled the first few days. The other officer shook his head, his face etched with fatigue. "Nothing, Rob. Every rest stop checked, every gas station queried, every small town along the route pinged. We've reviewed traffic cam footage until our eyes bled." Roberts rubbed his tired eyes. He'd spoken to Carol and Sarah multiple times. He'd heard the hope in their voices during the initial search, then the tremor of fear, and now the dull ache of despair. He saw the photos of the Miller kids on his desk. Tom with his mischievous grin, Emily with that teenage blend of confidence and vulnerability. They looked like any kids, a normal family on a normal trip. How could this happen? The lack of any evidence was the most baffling and the most terrifying aspect of the case. No accident scene meant no easy explanation. No trace of them suggested something deliberate or something so catastrophic it left literally nothing behind. An almost impossible scenario. In Oak Haven, Ohio, the initial shock had given way to a persistent, gnawing pain. Sarah felt it every time she drove past the Millers' quiet, dark house. The lawn, now a little overgrown, the porch swing still. She still talked to Carol daily, their conversations often dissolving into choked sobs or frustrated silences. The community had rallied at first. Candlelight vigils, fundraisers to help with search costs, ribbons tied around trees. But as the weeks wore on with no news, the crowds at the vigils thinned, the ribbons faded in the sun. Life in Oak Haven, slowly and guiltily, began to move on. But for those closest to them, life was frozen. The parents were gone, but so were the children. The missing faces haunted their days and nightmares. Carol found herself staring at her phone, half expecting it to ring, to hear Mary's voice on the other end, apologizing for the mix-up. The casserole dish sat in her freezer, a heartbreaking monument to a dinner that never happened. Detective Roberts felt their pain, felt the weight of their unanswered questions pressing down on him. He was a professional, trained to follow facts, to be objective. But cases like this, the ones with no leads, no logic, they chipped away at you. They left you with the faces of the missing and the haunted eyes of those left behind. He'd reviewed the family's finances, their backgrounds, interviewed neighbors and colleagues ad nauseum. Nothing pointed to any reason for them to voluntarily disappear. No enemies, no debts, no secret lives, just gone. The case files grew thicker, filled with reports, witness statements that led nowhere, dead-end tips. The initial energy of the investigation had dissipated, replaced by the slow, painstaking process of re-interviewing, re-examining the same fruitless information, hoping to find something, anything that had been missed. But the truth was they were running on fumes. The leads had dried up. The trail, if there ever was one, had gone completely cold. Detective Roberts sat in the quiet office, the only sound the low hum of the fluorescent lights. He looked at the map again, then at the photos. A family, a minivan, a stretch of highway, and then, simply, nothing. The emptiness of the search area felt mirrored by the vast, terrifying emptiness of the unknown. The Miller family had vanished, leaving behind only a void and a million unanswered questions echoing in the silence. 7 years. The words felt impossibly heavy on Sarah's tongue. 7 years since the Miller family minivan disappeared somewhere between Ohio and Iowa. 7 years since the frantic phone calls, the fruitless searches, the slow, agonizing realization that they were gone. 7 years of emptiness where laughter and light used to be. Oakhaven had tried its best to move on. A small, tasteful memorial plaque sat on a bench in the town square, dedicated to the Miller family. The porch light at their house, once left on perpetually as a beacon, was now dark. The house itself had been sold, new people living behind its walls, oblivious to the silent scream that still echoed there for those who remembered. For Carol, the years had been a slow, steady erosion of hope. The sharp edges of grief had softened, replaced by a dull, constant ache. She visited Mary and John's gravesite, even though there were no bodies beneath the stones. A place to bring flowers, a place to talk to the wind. Tom and Emily's birthdays were quiet, painful anniversaries marked by silent tears and memories that felt both vividly present and impossibly distant. The casserole dish remained in her freezer, a relic of a life interrupted. She had learned to live with the not knowing, a fragile peace built on the acceptance that some questions might never have answers. Most days, she just tried to get through. Detective Robert Roberts had moved on too in the professional sense. He was now a captain, his office in Des Moines cleaner, quieter. The Miller file wasn't on his desk anymore. It was stored in the archives, a thick binder among hundreds of others. Cold cases, unsolved mysteries. He still thought about them sometimes, usually late at night, reviewing the lack of evidence, the dead ends. It was the case that haunted him, the one that defied logic, the family swallowed by the road. He carried the weight of it, the professional failure, the human tragedy. He'd done everything he could, he'd told himself, but it wasn't enough. But Sarah couldn't let go. Couldn't move on. Mary was her best friend. Emily and Tom were like her own niece and nephew. The idea that they were just gone without a trace was a wound that refused to close. While the official investigation had dwindled to nothing, Sarah's had just begun. Her small spare room was now a makeshift investigation hub. A corkboard on the wall was covered in maps, photos, timelines, and handwritten notes. Binders overflowed with news clippings, police reports she'd managed to get through Freedom of Information Act requests, and printouts from missing persons forums online. She followed up on every crackpot theory, every reported sighting, every online rumor no matter how far-fetched. She'd contacted other families of missing persons, sharing stories of bureaucratic hurdles and the unique agony of ambiguous loss. Her husband worried about her. Her friends told her she needed to find peace, to stop living in the past. But how could she? Peace felt like a betrayal. Stopping meant giving up on Mary, John, Emily, and Tom. She learned about car models, highway numbers, terrain features. She spent hours poring over satellite maps of the route, looking for anything. A faint track, an anomaly, anything that didn't look like it belonged. She contacted truckers who regularly drove that route, showed them the photos, asked if they remembered anything unusual from that week, that day. Most didn't. Some offered kind words. A few eyed her with suspicion. It was a lonely, exhausting pursuit, fueled by grief and a stubborn, burning need for answers. It wasn't a glamorous detective story, it was just Sarah, a woman with a binder and a broken heart, refusing to let the world forget. The file might be cold in a police archive, but in Sarah's spare room, the search was still very much alive. Every dead end was a fresh disappointment, but also a confirmation that she was still looking. The silence of the past 7 years was deafening, but Sarah was listening, always listening, for the faintest echo of the truth. 15 miles off the nearest state highway, down a winding unpaved road that dissolved into little more than 2 tire tracks choked with weeds, lay the forgotten edge of Blackwood State Park. It wasn't on any official map for hikers, too remote, too overgrown, too steep in places. But for 17-year-old Jake and his best friend Maya, it was an adventure, a place to escape the predictable boredom of their small town, to explore where they weren't supposed to be. It was a humid Saturday in early spring, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and new leaves. They were scrambling down a wooded embankment, following a barely-there deer trail that twisted through a tangle of oak and sycamore trees, aiming for a small, unnamed creek they'd seen on a topographical map. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in shifting patterns, dappling the forest floor. "Dude, are you sure this is right?" Maya asked, pushing a low-hanging branch out of her face. "Feels like we're just bushwhacking." "Pretty sure," Jake said, consulting the worn map he held. "The creek should be just down there." He pointed toward the bottom of a shallow ravine choked with 7 years' worth of fallen leaves and decaying branches. They carefully picked their way down the slope, the ground soft and uneven under their sneakers. As Jake stepped over a moss-covered log, his foot snagged on something hidden beneath the leaf litter. He stumbled, catching himself on a tree trunk. "Whoa, careful," Maya said. "Yeah, thanks," Jake muttered, kicking at the leaves where he'd tripped. "Must be a root or something." But it wasn't a root. As he cleared away the wet, decaying leaves, a patch of faded, unnatural color emerged, a dull, murky blue. Curiosity piqued, he knelt down and brushed away more debris. It was fabric, canvas. And as he uncovered more, a shape began to emerge. Maya came over, peering down. "What is that? Looks like junk." It did at first glance. A lumpy, mildewed thing. Half buried. Jake pulled at a strap and the object shifted. It was a backpack. A child's backpack, once brightly colored blue with a yellow drawstring closure, now stained, faded, and partially collapsed. It looked like it had been there for a very long time. "Weird," Jake said, pulling it free. It was heavier than expected, damp and smelling faintly of mold. The fabric was stiff and brittle. He turned it over. The yellow drawstring had come undone, and something tumbled out onto the leaves. It was a small plastic action figure, its bright red cape dulled, one arm broken off. Next came a handful of rocks and acorns, then a crumpled, faded drawing on construction paper, a wobbly house, a stick figure family. And then something else. A small plastic sandwich bag, surprisingly intact, though clouded with condensation. Inside, nestled amongst some dried-up crumbs, was a school ID card. Jake picked it up, his fingers clumsy. The plastic was cool and slightly warped. He wiped away some of the condensation with his thumb. A photo stared back at him. A smiling face, gap teeth, bright eyes, a name printed underneath. Tom Miller. His blood ran cold. He knew that name. Everyone in Oakhaven knew that name, even 7 years later. The missing family. The minivan that vanished. The faces on the flyers that had haunted the town. Maya saw his expression. "Jake, what is it? What's wrong?" He held out the ID card, his hand shaking slightly. Maya took it, her eyes widening as she read the name, then looked at the photo. The casual boredom of moments before evaporated, replaced by a dawning horror. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The Millers? Like, the Millers?" Jake nodded, unable to speak. He looked back at the muddy, dilapidated backpack lying on the leaves, the sad little action figure beside it. A child's things. Left here, in the middle of nowhere. The excitement of their forbidden adventure drained away, leaving behind a cold, heavy dread. This wasn't just junk. This wasn't just a random lost item. This was something real, something terrible surfacing after years of silence. We have to call someone, Maya said, her voice still shaky. Yeah, Jake agreed, pulling out his phone, his fingers fumbling with the screen. The signal was weak, but maybe, just maybe, strong enough. He dialed 911, the sound of the call connecting, echoing in the sudden, profound silence of the woods. Their adventure was over. The real and terrifying story had just begun to reveal itself. Detective Captain Robert Roberts was staring at a stack of paperwork, budget requests, internal reports, the mundane administrative debris of running a police division, when the call came in. His office in Des Moines was quiet, functional, a world away from the chaotic energy of the early days of an investigation. 7 years of command had added a few more lines around his eyes and a slight stiffness to his shoulders, but the sharp intelligence was still there, just buried a little deeper under layers of procedure and protocol. Captain Roberts, his secretary's voice said through the intercom. Deputy Miller from Harrison County Sheriff's Office on line 1 says it's about something found out in the woods. Put him through, Roberts sighed, pushing the budget reports aside. Another hunter, stumbling across a decades-old meth lab maybe, or some kids finding discarded junk. Routine. Roberts, he said into the receiver. Captain, Deputy Miller here. Got a couple of teenagers found something out near Blackwood State Park, off the main trail's remote area. The deputy's voice was a little hesitant, unsure if this was important enough for a captain. Looks like some old personal items, a backpack, some toys. Old, huh? Roberts said, grabbing a pen ready to jot down the details for dispatch to handle. Doesn't sound like anything urgent. Probably just trash. Could be, sir, Miller conceded, but there was an ID card in the backpack, kid's ID. Okay, Roberts said, scribbling kid's ID, backpack. What's the name? There was a brief pause on the other end. Says, Tom Miller, from Oak Haven, Ohio. The pen in Roberts' hand stopped midair. The low hum of the office faded. The administrative fatigue vanished in an instant, replaced by a jolt of pure, raw adrenaline. Tom Miller. The name hit him like a physical blow, pulling him back across 7 years and 100 other cases. Say that again, Roberts said, his voice suddenly sharp, the weariness gone. Tom Miller, captain. School ID. Photo looks like a young boy. Secure the scene immediately, Roberts ordered, pushing himself up from his desk, the chair scraping back. Deputy, do not touch anything else. Do not let anyone near the area. I'm coming there. Who found it? 2 teenagers, sir, Jake and Maya Peterson. They called it in. Keep them there. Separate them. No talking to anyone else until I get there. Understand? Yes, sir. The deputy's tone was suddenly crisp, recognizing the shift in urgency. Roberts hung up the phone, his mind racing. Tom Miller. A missing child from a missing family. A case that had haunted him for years. He walked out of his office, grabbing his coat. Cancel everything, he told his secretary, his voice loud in the quiet office. Get Sergeant Hansen and Detective Chen. Tell them to meet me in the conference room in 5 minutes, and pull the Miller family file from the archives. The whole thing, all of it. He didn't wait for a response, striding down the hallway towards the archives. The air felt suddenly thin. Years of dust, literal and figurative, were about to be disturbed. Back in the conference room, Hansen and Chen looked at him, their expressions questioning. Roberts didn't waste time. Miller family case. Oak Haven, Ohio, went missing 7 years ago traveling through Iowa. He saw recognition dawn on their faces. It was that case, the one with no answers. Something's been found, Roberts continued, his voice tight with a mixture of tension and a fragile, terrifying hope. Out in the woods in Harrison County, a child's backpack. with Tom Miller's ID in it. He saw the shock register on his team's faces. Cold cases didn't just warm up like this, not after 7 years. "We're going to the scene," Roberts said, his gaze sweeping over them. "Hanson, you coordinate with the Harrison County Sheriff's Office, get a full perimeter established, call in forensics. Chen, you start reviewing the original case file on the way. I want to know everything, every dead end, every unanswered question." He grabbed the newly retrieved thick Miller file from his desk, the paper yellowed with age. Holding it felt different now. It wasn't just a symbol of failure anymore. It was a possibility, a chance. Driving west, the cityscape gave way to the familiar, sprawling farmlands of Iowa. Roberts drove fast, the silence in the car broken only by the crackle of the police radio and the rustle of paper as Detective Chen began poring over the old reports in the back seat. He looked out at the passing fields, the endless horizon. For 7 years, this landscape had held its secrets, absorbing a family without a trace. Now, maybe, just maybe, it was ready to give something back. The cold case was stirring, and Detective Robert Roberts felt a surge of purpose he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Hope, tentative and dangerous, was reignited. The gravel road ended abruptly, giving way to a narrow, overgrown track that felt more like a scar in the earth than a path. Detective Captain Roberts parked the unmarked SUV behind a couple of Sheriff's Department cruisers and got out, the air immediately thicker, cooler, and heavy with the scent of damp soil and decaying leaves. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense canopy overhead. This wasn't just remote, it felt hidden. Deputy Miller met him, a young officer with a nervous energy. "Captain, over here. The kids are waiting back by the cars." He gestured towards the ravine. The backpack was found just down there. Roberts nodded, his gaze sweeping the area. It was a steep, wooded slope, thick with underbrush and fallen trees. Easy to get lost, easier still to hide something. The kind of place most people wouldn't stumble into. He made his way carefully down the embankment, the ground slippery underfoot. Sergeant Hanson and Detective Chen followed, their usual easy demeanor replaced by a focused intensity. Yellow crime scene tape was already being strung between trees, sectioning off the immediate area. Forensic technicians, clad in white protective suits, were beginning to arrive, their equipment bags looking stark and out of place against the natural backdrop. Roberts reached the bottom of the small ravine. Deputy Miller pointed to a spot near a large, moss-covered rock. Right there, partially covered by leaves. Roberts knelt down, his eyes fixed on the small blue backpack now resting carefully on a clean tarp laid by the local deputies. It was exactly as described, faded, mildewed, misshapen from time and weather. He saw the yellow drawstring, the once bright color now muted to a sickly yellow. He saw the spilled contents, the small red-caped action figure, its plastic dulled, one arm broken off, the scattering of rocks and acorns, the crumpled, faded drawing of the house, and the plastic bag containing the school ID. He looked at the ID card again, at Tom Miller's smiling face, captured at a moment in time that felt impossibly distant. The contrast between the vibrant child in the photo and the forlorn, discarded items in this damp, silent woods was a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a cold case file anymore, this was real. These were a child's things left behind in this forgotten place. "Bag the backpack and everything immediately around it," Roberts instructed the forensic technician kneeling nearby, his voice low and steady despite the tremor he felt inside. "Handle everything with extreme care. I want this entire ravine, and the slopes leading down to it, processed. Every inch. Sift through the leaf litter. Check under every log, behind every rock, slowly and methodically." As the forensic team began their meticulous work, Roberts and his detectives started a slow, careful visual sweep of the immediate vicinity, staying outside the taped-off area. They moved with deliberate steps, eyes scanning the ground, the trees, the underbrush. "Look for anything unnatural," Roberts murmured. "Anything that doesn't belong here. Anything that might have been dropped, snagged, or overlooked." It was painstaking work. 7 years of leaves, branches, and natural decay had effectively buried anything smaller or less durable than the backpack. But as they worked their way around the ravine, small, significant details began to emerge. Sergeant Hansen called out softly, "Captain, over here." Roberts moved towards him. Hansen was kneeling near a thicket of ferns, pointing to something partially hidden beneath a cluster of leaves. Roberts knelt beside him. It was a small child's sneaker, its bright blue fabric now stained dark and cracked with age. It looked like it had been kicked off in a hurry. A little further on, Detective Chen found a small, inexpensive silver locket, its chain broken, lying near the base of a large oak tree. It was tarnished and plain, the kind a teenage girl might wear. Emily, Roberts himself, carefully pushing aside a tangle of vines, spotted a flash of color. A small piece of brightly patterned fabric snagged on a thorny branch. It looked like it had been ripped from a larger piece of clothing, maybe a shirt or a jacket lining. None of these were definitive. They were weathered, broken, half buried, but together, with the backpack and the ID, they painted a chilling picture. A family, or at least some members of it, had been in this remote, hidden spot. And whatever happened here had caused them to lose their belongings, to leave them scattered and forgotten. The peaceful quiet of the woods now felt heavy with unspoken history. The rustle of leaves under the forensic team's feet, the quiet clicks of their cameras, the hushed tones of the officers. These were the only sounds disturbing a silence that had held its secrets for 7 long years. Looking at the small pile of recovered items, ordinary objects imbued with a profound sadness and significance, Roberts felt a renewed determination harden within him. They hadn't found a body. They hadn't found the minivan. But they had found a place where the Miller family's story, tragically, intersected with these quiet, indifferent woods. The search was no longer blind. It had a focal point. And the woods, finally, were beginning to whisper. The items found in the Blackwood State Park ravine were treated with the reverence of sacred relics. Each piece, the faded blue backpack, the broken action figure, the crumpled drawing, the small tarnished locket, the cracked blue sneaker, the torn scrap of fabric, and the warped plastic ID card, was carefully photographed in situ, measured, and then gently placed into separate evidence bags by the white-suited forensic technicians. The process was slow, methodical, a stark contrast to the raw emotion the discovery had unearthed. Back at the state crime lab, the sterile environment felt 1,000,000 miles away from the damp, leaf-strewn woods. The recovered items were laid out under harsh lights. Forensic scientists, their faces intent, began their work. Fibers from the backpack were analyzed, hoping to match them to anything known about the minivan or the family's clothing. The drawing was examined for any hidden details or clues. They attempted to recover data from the damaged ID card, though its condition wasn't promising. Crucially, they looked for any trace evidence: hair, fibers, soil unique to other locations, and potential DNA. Detective Chen, back from the scene, sat in Robert's office, reviewing the initial reports coming in from the lab. "The preliminary analysis confirms the ID is authentic, Captain. Matches Tom Miller's school records." Roberts nodded, though the confirmation wasn't a surprise. Seeing the photo, holding the card, he'd known. What about the other items? "Consistent with family's belongings," Chen reported, scanning the document. "The locket is costume jewelry but matches descriptions from Sarah Jenkins, Mary Miller's friend, of a locket Emily often wore. The sneaker is a child's size consistent with Tom's age at the time of disappearance. The fabric scrap. They're doing fiber analysis, but the color and type could match clothing Mary was reported to have worn." He paused, looking up. "And they found trace DNA on the inside of the backpack. preliminary match to the Miller family's genetic profile based on samples provided by relatives 7 years ago. It's definitive, Captain. These items belong to them, to Tom, to Emily, to Mary, or John. The words hung in the air, heavy with confirmation. These wasn't a false lead, a cruel coincidence. The cold case was undeniably, tragically hot again. The Miller family had been in those woods. Back at the scene under Robert's direction, the focus shifted from simply collecting discarded items to understanding how they got there. The terrain was difficult. While it was possible someone could walk in, bringing 4 people and a significant amount of luggage was unlikely on foot. The presence of scattered, heavier items suggested they weren't just dropped quickly. A specialized team was brought in, trained in identifying subtle disturbances in the natural environment. Their mission: find evidence of a vehicle. They fanned out from the ravine, expanding the search perimeter, looking for anything that indicated tires had passed through an area normally untouched by vehicles. It was painstaking, minute work. Overgrown tracks, faint compressions in the soil hidden by leaves, broken branches at fender height, disturbed rocks that looked out of place. The forest floor, left undisturbed for years, held a fragile memory of anything that had significantly disrupted it. Hours later, a call came over the radio. "Captain, we've got something." Roberts and Chen made their way through the trees, following the voice. They found 2 technicians kneeling on the edge of a less steep, but still remote slope several hundred yards from the ravine. "Here, sir," one of them said, pointing. "Faint impressions, mostly filled in with leaves and sediment. But the pattern, and this." He pointed to a larger rock nearby. "Looks like it was recently, relatively speaking, dislodged and rolled here, and the vegetation around it is compressed in a way consistent with a heavy object passing." Roberts knelt, examining the area. It was subtle, almost invisible to the untrained eye, but looking closely he could see the faint ghost of a track leading into the thicker woods and what appeared to be a similar, equally faint track heading back out. 7 years of natural processes had done their best to erase the evidence, but they hadn't been entirely successful. The tracks were difficult to make out, impossible to identify definitively without more analysis, but they were there. Evidence that a vehicle, likely not a small one, had accessed this remote spot. "Mark this area," Roberts said, his voice grim. "Get casts if you can, even partial ones. Photograph everything. We need soil samples, vegetation samples from the tracks. We need to know what kind of vehicle might have been here and when, if possible." Standing in the silent woods, the faint scent of damp earth in the air, Roberts looked from the area of the possible tire tracks back towards the ravine where the family's belongings were found. The scientific confirmation from the lab had cemented the connection. The potential discovery of vehicle tracks here suggested a terrifying possibility. The Miller family, or at least their remains or belongings, had been brought to this hidden spot by someone. The mystery hadn't been solved. It had just gotten infinitely darker and more complex. The woods had spoken, and their whisper was chilling. The confirmation from the lab and the discovery of potential tire tracks gave the investigators a target area, but no immediate suspects. The vastness of the who and why remained. To breathe life back into the cold case, Detective Captain Roberts knew they had to revisit the past, specifically the people who were living or working in or around that remote section of Blackwood State Park 7 years ago. It was a tedious, painstaking process. They cross-referenced property records, old hunting permits, local business licenses, anything that might give them a list of names. Then came the interviews. Sergeant Hansen and Detective Chen spent days knocking on doors in small scattered communities bordering the park, talking to people whose memories had had 7 years to fade, distort, or simply forget. Most interviews were polite but fruitless. 7 years ago? Good heavens, I barely remember what I had for breakfast yesterday. Or, lots of trucks out that way, folks going logging or hunting. Didn't pay much mind. The sheer ordinariness of rural life was, in this case, an obstacle. Unusual things blended into the background of daily routine. Roberts felt the familiar frustration of a cold case investigator, the sense of chasing ghosts in the fog of time, but the sight of Tom Miller's ID card kept him going. One lead led them to a small, weathered farmhouse perched on a hill overlooking a section of the park, not far from where the items were found. The owner was an elderly man named Mr. Silas Croft, known locally as a bit of a recluse, rarely leaving his property. He'd lived there his whole life. Roberts decided to handle this interview himself. He drove down a long, bumpy dirt driveway, the farmhouse looking like it had grown right out of the land. Mr. Croft met him on the porch, a lean man with eyes the color of faded denim, sharp despite his years. He agreed to talk, inviting Roberts into a sparse living room that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper. "Sheriff's been by before," Mr. Croft said, settling into a worn armchair. "Years ago. Asked about folks I might have seen round here." "Yes, sir," Roberts said, sitting across from him. That was about the Miller family disappearance, a family from Ohio. They went missing about 7 years ago, driving through the state. Mr. Croft nodded slowly. "Heard about that. Sad business. Don't get many strangers around here, not usually." Roberts showed him the flyers from 7 years ago, the photos of the smiling family. Mr. Croft studied them, his gaze lingering on the children's faces. "Poor souls." "Mr. Croft," Roberts began, choosing his words carefully, "we recently found some items belonging to the Miller family, out in the woods, not far from here." He gestured vaguely towards the park. "We believe they may have been in that area around the time they disappeared. We're revisiting everyone who lived nearby back then, hoping someone might have seen something unusual. Anything at all." Mr. Croft was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant, looking past Roberts, seemingly into the intervening years. He rubbed his chin, a slow, thoughtful gesture. "Unusual," he murmured as if testing the word. "Well, out that way. It's mostly just hunters in the fall. Don't get many cars back on them old logging trails in the summer. Too rough." Roberts waited, letting the silence hang, giving the old man space to search his memory. "Was about that time, I reckon," Mr. Croft finally said, his voice low. "Early summer. Hot spell like I recall. I was out tending to the back fence near the tree line. Saw a truck." Roberts leaned forward slightly. "A truck? What kind of truck, do you remember?" Mr. Croft frowned, concentrating. "Just a pickup. Older model, I think, dark-colored. What caught my eye was where it was. Parked off the trail a bit, near that old creek bed, nowhere near where folks usually go." "What time of day was this?" "Hard to say exactly," Mr. Croft admitted. "Middle of the day, maybe afternoon. Sun was high. Remember thinking it was odd. Nobody hunting. Too hot for much hiking. Just sat there for maybe an hour or so. Then it drove off." "Did you see anyone with the truck?" Roberts asked, his pulse quickening. Mr. Croft shook his head. "Nope. Couldn't see anyone clearly, just the truck parked there. Didn't think much of it at the time. Figured maybe someone got stuck or was just taking a break. Like I said, not many strangers back there. Figured they knew what they was doing." He looked at Roberts, his faded blue eyes holding a question. You think that truck had something to do with them folks? The Millers?" Roberts didn't answer directly. The description was vague. An older, dark-colored pickup. But the location, near that old creek bed, which wasn't far from where the backpack was found, and the timing, potentially around when the Millers disappeared, felt like more than a coincidence. It was a fragmented memory from 7 years ago, perhaps unreliable, perhaps crucial. "Every piece of information helps, Mr. Croft," Roberts said, his voice carefully neutral. "We appreciate you telling us." As Roberts left the farmhouse, the setting sun cast long shadows across the fields. The old pickup truck, seen briefly and dismissively by a reclusive farmer 7 years ago, had just driven its way into the heart of a cold case. It wasn't much, a glimpse, a faded memory, but after years of silence it felt like the first faint echo of the truth bouncing back from the depths of the woods. The circle was beginning to tighten, slowly, uncertainly, around a dark-colored truck in the remote area where the Miller family's belongings had waited patiently to be found. The conference room air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and dry erase markers. Photos of the recovered items were pinned to the board: Tom's faded backpack, the small, tarnished locket, the blue sneaker looking heartbreakingly small. Maps of Blackwood State Park, marked with grid lines, and the circled Discovery site covered another section of the wall. Notes from Mr. Croft's interview detailing the sighting of the dark pickup truck were taped next to blurry photographs of the faint tire track impressions from the ravine slope. Detective Captain Roberts, Sergeant Hansen, and Detective Chen were hunched over the table, piecing together the fragments of the past. "Okay, let's walk through this," Roberts said, tapping a pen on the table. "We have confirmed belongings of the Miller family found scattered in a remote ravine. Not a crash site on the highway, not a rest stop. Deep in the woods. The items were partially buried, partially just lying there," Chen added, "consistent with being dumped, maybe hastily, rather than being there as a result of a vehicle accident in that exact spot. A vehicle couldn't have crashed into that ravine. And we have evidence suggesting a vehicle accessed the area." Hansen pointed to the photos of the faint tracks. "Difficult terrain, off the main roads, but a truck could get in there if you knew the way." Roberts nodded, which brings us to Mr. Croft's testimony. A dark pickup truck parked in an unusual spot near that area around the time the family went missing. A dark pickup truck seen where a dark pickup truck shouldn't usually be, near where the family's belongings were found in an area that could have been accessed by a truck leaving faint tracks, Chen summarized, the connections clicking into place. The implications were clear and chilling. The Miller family's disappearance likely didn't end on the highway. It ended, or at least intersected, with that remote patch of woods. And they, or their belongings, were brought there. "This wasn't random," Roberts stated, looking at the map of the park. "Someone didn't just get lost and stumble into that ravine with the family's belongings. Whoever brought them there knew that area, knew how to get a vehicle in and out without using marked trails, knew it was remote and unlikely to be searched thoroughly in the initial days." This realization was key. It shifted the focus of the investigation dramatically. They weren't looking for a random person who might have intersected with the Millers on the highway. They were looking for someone with a specific connection to this remote area of Blackwood State Park. "We're looking for someone local," Hansen said, voicing the obvious conclusion. "Someone who knew those woods like the back of their hand. A hunter, a logger, maybe someone with property bordering the park, someone who spent a lot of time out there off the beaten path." The brainstorming began. They compiled lists based on old records, individuals who owned property adjacent to that section of the park, logging companies operating in the area 7 years ago, registered hunters known to frequent that part of the park, even former park employees who might have had intimate knowledge of the terrain. Then they cross-referenced those lists with vehicle registration records from around that time, looking for individuals in the area who owned dark-colored pickup trucks. It was a painstaking process, filtering out the hundreds of ordinary residents from the handful who fit the specific criteria. The whiteboard began to fill with names connected by lines to potential addresses, vehicle types, and any known history in the area. The vast, impossible void of the cold case was beginning to shrink, tightening around a specific geographic area and a specific type of person. They discussed motives. Why bring them there? To hide evidence? To dispose of something or someone where they wouldn't be found? The grim possibilities hung in the air. By the end of the day, the sprawling map of the Miller family's route had been largely replaced by a detailed focus on a few square miles of dense woodland and the names of a handful of individuals who knew its secrets. They didn't have a suspect yet, not definitively, but they had a much clearer picture of who they might be looking for. The circle of uncertainty had narrowed, and the names on the whiteboard felt less like abstract possibilities and more like potential answers, each one a thread leading deeper into the 7-year-old mystery. The hunt was no longer for a vanished family. It was for the person who had taken them, or their belongings, to the silent, waiting woods. The name at the top of the narrowed list was Dale Prendergast, 62 years old. Lived alone in a small, dilapidated cabin on 40 acres bordering Blackwood State Park, about 3 miles as the crow flies from where the Miller family's belongings were found. Owned a dark green, late 80s Ford pickup truck, the kind that could navigate rough terrain. Had a minor record from 20 years ago, a bar fight, nothing serious. Kept to himself. Frequented that particular remote section of the park for hunting and trapping. He fit the profile. Roberts and Chen drove out to Dale's cabin early on a Tuesday morning. The cabin was small, surrounded by tangled woods. Dale was sitting on his porch, sharpening a knife, a mangy dog asleep at his feet. He didn't seem surprised to see them, just wary. "Mr. Prendergast," Roberts said, approaching slowly. "We're with the sheriff's department. Captain Roberts, Detective Chen. We're following up on something found in the park." Dale's eyes narrowed slightly. He set the knife down. "Found lots of things in the park over the years. What kind of thing?" "Some old personal items," Chen said. "Belonging to the Miller family. They went missing about 7 years ago." Dale's gaze flickered. He didn't say anything, just watched them, his face unreadable. "We'd like you to come down to the station and answer some questions," Roberts said, keeping his tone even. "Nothing formal yet, just trying to understand if you saw anything around that time." Dale hesitated, then slowly nodded. "All right, suppose I can." The interrogation room was small, sterile, the air conditioner humming loudly. Dale sat across the table from Roberts and Chen, his hands clasped, his gaze fixed on the surface of the table. He answered questions about his property, his truck, how often he went into the park. He admitted he knew the remote trails well, used them for hunting. "Were you in the park, near the old creek bed 7 years ago, around early summer?" Roberts asked, watching him closely. Dale shrugged. "Might have been. Hunting season wasn't open, but I go out there, check traps, just walk." "Did you see a dark-colored pickup truck parked out there around that time?" Chen interjected, watching for a reaction. Dale's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "See trucks all the time. Hunters, loggers." "This one was parked off the trail," Roberts pressed gently. "Someone saw it, about an hour or so east of where you are now." Dale finally looked up, his eyes meeting Roberts'. There was a flicker of something there. Fear? Resignation? "Maybe I did," Dale mumbled, his voice low. "Can't rightly recall. It was a long time ago." Roberts leaned forward, his voice softening slightly but firm. "Mr. Prendergast, we found those items, the backpack, the shoe, the locket, in a ravine not far from where that truck was seen, and we found evidence suggesting a vehicle accessed that area. A truck, Mr. Prendergast. Tire tracks consistent with a truck like yours." He placed photos of the faint tracks on the table. Dale stared at them, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his hands together. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with unspoken truth. Roberts decided to push. 7 years is a long time to carry something, Mr. Prendergast. A long time for a secret." Dale's breath hitched. His eyes squeezed shut for a moment. When he opened them, they were glistening. His carefully constructed wall began to crumble. It was an accident," he choked out, the words rough, painful. "God help me, it was just a terrible accident." Roberts and Chen remained silent, letting him speak, letting the 7 years of pent-up guilt pour out. "I was coming back from the south end of my property," Dale began, his voice trembling. "Use that old logging track. Don't nobody use it much. Thought I was alone out there." He described the minivan, how it appeared unexpectedly, having somehow gotten onto the rough track, maybe trying to turn around or find a different way. The track was narrow. There was a close call, maybe a fender brush. He was unclear on the exact details, fueled by panic over the years. "The road just gave way," Dale said, tears tracking through the dust on his face. "Right at the edge of the ravine. Soft, from the rain a few days before, maybe. The minivan. It just slid. Went right over the edge." He scrambled down the steep slope. It was chaos. The minivan was crumpled, resting precariously. He found them. It was immediately clear. They were gone. All of them. A terrible, sudden, unforeseen tragedy in the middle of nowhere. "I panicked," Dale confessed, his voice a broken whisper. "I ain't got no phone out there. Nearest neighbor's miles away, and I got that old record. I figured they'd blame me. Say I ran him off the road or something. I wasn't thinking right." He made the horrific decision. He went back to his truck. He climbed down into the ravine, the smell of gasoline and damp earth thick in the air. He pulled out what he could, the backpack, some things that had been thrown from the vehicle. He knew he had to hide them, hide everything. "I scattered their things," he sobbed, the memory clearly agonizing. "Just threw 'em up the bank. Didn't want nobody to find 'em. Then I pushed the van further down the ravine, into the creek bed. Figured the water, the mud, it'd take it, hide it." He used his truck, maneuvering it as close as he dared, using a winch he had for logging work, anything he could to push the mangled vehicle deeper into the thickest part of the ravine, into the creek bed, praying it would be swallowed by the earth and water. It took hours. Exhausting, terrifying work fueled by blind panic. He buried the remaining bodies as best he could, shallow graves dug in haste and desperation in the remote woods, a place he knew would likely remain undisturbed. The narrative avoids graphic detail here, focusing on the act of concealment born of panic, not the state of the bodies. He drove away that day and never told a soul. Lived with the secret, the guilt a constant heavy burden. Every passing siren, every stranger on his road, every news report about the cold case was a fresh wave of terror and remorse. He had silenced the accident, but the silence had become his own prison. Roberts and Chen listened, their faces grim. The truth was devastatingly simple and tragically realistically human, not the work of a monster, but of a scared, isolated man making a series of catastrophic choices in the face of overwhelming panic. The mystery of the vanished Miller family was solved, but the truth wasn't a relief. It was a profound, heartbreaking tragedy. A wrong turn, a remote track, a terrible accident, and a desperate, misguided act of concealment had stolen a family from the world and condemned one man to a lifetime haunted by his secret. The silence was broken, but the sound was that of a man's confession and the echoes of a family lost forever in the quiet, indifferent woods. Guided by Dale Prendergast's confession, the search team returned to Blackwood State Park. The atmosphere was different this time. No longer a blind search fueled by faint hope, but a grim, targeted mission based on a terrible truth. Roberts accompanied the team, the weight of the past 7 years heavy on his shoulders. Dale had described a section of the ravine further downstream from where the belongings were found, a place where the creek bed was deeper and the terrain even more challenging. It was a place where something or someone could disappear. The team moved slowly, methodically, battling thick brush and uneven ground, the sound of the creek their constant companion. Hours passed, marked by the rustle of leaves and the quiet commands of the team leader. The air grew colder as they descended deeper into the ravine, the sunlight barely penetrating the dense tree cover overhead. Then a shout echoed through the woods. "Captain, over here!" Roberts scrambled toward the sound. Near a bend in the creek, partially submerged in muddy water and heavily obscured by fallen trees and sediment, was a twisted, unrecognizable mass of metal. It was crushed, rusted, swallowed by the earth over 7 years. But as they got closer, the shape, the size, the remnants of a wheel well. It was undeniable. It was the minivan, the Miller family's blue minivan. The discovery was met with a somber silence. This wasn't a moment of triumph, but of profound sadness. It was the physical manifestation of a tragedy, hidden away for years, now brought back into the light. Recovery of the wreckage was a difficult, painstaking process, requiring specialized equipment to navigate the treacherous terrain. As they worked, the grim reality of Dale's confession became clearer with every pulled piece of mangled metal, every scoop of dark, wet sediment. The search continued in the immediate vicinity, focusing on the areas Dale had indicated as the hasty burial sites. This part of the task was the most difficult, the air thick with unspoken grief and the quiet determination of the team. They worked with respect, their movements careful, their faces etched with the weight of the discovery. And then they were found. Not all together, not in a way that offered comfort, but confirming Dale's desperate, panicked actions. The details were horrific, born of a sudden violent event and a desperate, amateurish attempt at concealment. But the police presence, the careful work of the forensic team, the simple fact of their discovery, it brought an end to the agonizing uncertainty. Roberts stood to the side, watching the grim work, the sound of the creek rushing over rocks a mournful backdrop. 7 years. The smiling faces from the missing posters flashed in his mind. Tom, Emily, Mary, John. Their journey had ended here, in this quiet, forgotten ravine, not with fanfare or resolution, but with a tragic accident and a man's terrible fear. He felt a complex mix of emotions, relief that they were found, sorrow for their fate, and the heavy burden of having carried this case for so long. The mystery was over. The truth was devastating. Back in Oak Haven, the news reached Sarah like a physical blow. Captain Roberts called her himself, his voice gentle but firm, explaining they had found the minivan and the family. Sarah listened, the phone shaking in her hand, tears streaming down her face. It was the call she had longed for, dreaded, and endlessly imagined for 7 years. The not knowing was over. She drove to the designated police liaison point near the park entrance, a place far removed from the recovery operation. Roberts met her there. He didn't need to say much. His expression, the quiet efficiency of the officers, the distant hum of machinery, it all spoke volumes. "They were in the ravine, Sarah," Roberts said, his voice low. "It was an accident. According to the man who came forward, their van went off a rough track." Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She had pictured 1,000 scenarios over the years. Abduction, running away, foul play. The reality, a tragic random accident followed by panic, felt almost mundane in its cruelty. We found them," Roberts continued, his gaze meeting hers. It brings a form of closure." Closure. The word felt inadequate, cold. It didn't erase the years of pain, the missed birthdays, the empty chairs at holidays. But looking into Robert's tired, kind eyes, seeing the genuine sorrow etched there, Sarah knew this was the end of the search. The physical search, anyway. Standing there, at the edge of the woods that had held such a terrible secret, Sarah felt the full weight of her grief. They were gone. Found, finally, after all this time. The silence was over, replaced by the quiet, heartbreaking certainty of loss. The journey had ended not in a longed-for reunion, but in a remote, hidden ravine, a place of accidental tragedy and buried truth. The news spread like wildfire, first through hushed whispers in Oak Haven, then across national news channels. The Miller family, missing for 7 years, had been found. The truth, delivered with a somber professionalism by Captain Roberts in the Sheriff's Department, was both devastating and, finally, definitive. An accident, a remote road, a desperate, panicked act of concealment. Dale Prendergast was in custody, facing charges that would reflect the gravity of his actions, though the details of his legal fate were, in many ways, secondary to the human cost of his secret. In Oakhaven, the town processed the news with a collective, aching grief. The initial shock of the disappearance had been a violent storm, the years of not knowing a persistent, chilling fog. Now, the truth was a heavy rain, washing over the community, bringing sorrow but also, for the first time, the possibility of clearing the air. The faces of Mary, John, Emily, and Tom, once symbols of a baffling mystery, were now remembered with the clarity of their tragic end. A few weeks later, a memorial service was held in the town square near the bench with the plaque that now felt less like a question and more like a quiet tribute. Hundreds attended, neighbors, colleagues, friends, relatives from across the country. The air was filled with a profound sadness but also a sense of communal release. Stories were shared, of Mary's infectious laugh, John's quiet strength, Emily's vibrant spirit, Tom's boundless energy. They were remembered not just as the missing, but as the loved ones they were. Sarah stood with Carol, their hands clasped tightly. The tears still came, hot and heavy, but they were different tears now. Tears of mourning, not of agonizing uncertainty. For 7 years, their grief had been suspended, a wound that couldn't heal because the source wasn't known. Now, the wound was still there, still deep, but it could finally begin the long, slow process of scarring over. "They're home," Carol whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "They're finally home." Sarah squeezed her hand. Home, not in the way they had dreamed, not back in their comfortable house, but in a final, known resting place, no longer lost to the earth and a terrible secret. Detective Captain Roberts watched the service from a distance, a quiet, respectful observer. He saw Sarah and Carol, saw the other faces in the crowd. His role was over. The case was closed. The file would be marked resolved. But the faces of the Miller family would stay with him, a permanent reminder of the fragility of life and the unintended consequences of a moment's panic. He felt no triumph, only a deep, weary sadness and a quiet sense of having honored his promise to find them. The memory of the Millers didn't fade from Oakhaven. The plaque in the town square became a place of quiet reflection. The story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the unpredictable nature of life. But more importantly, the memory lived in the hearts of those who loved them. Sarah continued her work, not as an investigator anymore, but as an advocate for other families of missing persons, her painful experience giving her a unique empathy and determination. Carol, slowly, began to find moments of peace, tending her garden, sharing stories of her niece and nephew with a new generation of relatives. Closure, they learned, wasn't an event. It wasn't a flip switched from pain to peace. It was a process, a slow unfolding, a way of integrating the devastating truth into the fabric of their lives. The void left by the Miller family would never be truly filled, but knowing what happened allowed their loved ones to build bridges across it, bridges of memory, of love, and of the quiet, resilient strength of the human spirit. The mystery was solved, the secret unearthed, and in the wake of the truth, the long journey of grieving and remembering could finally, truly begin. Like and subscribe for more true mysteries.